So hi guys. This is going to be a super informal and kind of consider it like a casual chat with us on what the SAT is, what kind of content you need to learn, and it's basically what we're trying to do is not teach you how to get through the SAT exactly, because all of that will really come through practice. But what we're trying to do through this is kind of help your brain structure the SAT and understand how to tackle everything, just so you have like 1 or 2 lines of guidance for each section. I think that's the big thing we're aiming for. Aside from that, we're happy to offer as much support as we can in our capacity, but this is just like an introduction to what it is and how to approach it. Okay, so in terms of what it is and how to approach it again, basically the reason that you have to do the SAT, even if you've gotten really good A-level grades and all of that, is because it is something that is universal and that everyone is doing, and it's kind of like a controlled measure of your literacy, your writing, and your maths, right? So just because you are good at the SAT does not mean you are like super good at whatever subject you're going to study. It does not mean that even if you're like a literature student, it doesn't mean that you're going to ace the SAT. It also doesn't mean that you're going to fail the SAT. It's just another test that needs to be practiced. And another thing we want to emphasize is that though getting a good SAT score is very helpful, it's not everything to college admissions. It's still important to have a holistic application. It's still important to have really good essays. Scores alone is not going to get you in. I personally know someone who had basically a completely I think it was close to a perfect SAT score, who still didn't get the kind of financial aid that they wanted because they hadn't put enough effort into their essays. So do not think that it's like your application process is just focusing on the SAT. We don't want to give that impression. So these are all just things that you should keep in mind when you're approaching an exam, any kind of exam really, just so you don't excessively wait. I'm sure all of you guys know this, but the reason that it's important to take this is so that as universities look at your application, if they see a high number, they're like, okay, wow, this person has put in effort, this person knows what they're doing. Easier to consider them and look into detail to the rest of their application. Consider your SAT score as a way to grab people's attention, basically. While universities are mostly test optional right now for the SATs, we do try to recommend taking the SAT at some point so that you can submit some kind of score, just because of exactly what we told you. It's an easy way to stand out. And we definitely think you guys can stand out with the SAT. You've gotten through local A-levels, most of you can definitely do this, right? And also, most of us here want to get financial aid. High SAT scores generally, not all the time, but do generally translate into having better chances at getting financial aid and getting a good scholarship, particularly, for example, at like a need-blind university. They'll be willing to take you if you have a really, really good SAT score. So it's important to aim high. That being said, how high do we aim for? And this is where things kind of get complicated, I'd say. Most of you here want to apply to big brand name schools. And at these schools, people are trying very hard and there's a lot of competition. So yes, the scores are relatively high. As you can see from this list of about 10 that we've got here, the average SAT score is generally above 1,500 when you're applying to these schools. It's very high like this also because these kids have often spent a long time practicing for the SATs, like an entire year perhaps. We have other exams to do, so we don't put that much effort into it, which is why, yes, it is tough for us to catch up now, but it is still very much done and it's still very possible and doable. So something to keep in mind is that, yes, while a sure score to get in anywhere is like 1,550 plus, as you can see by the numbers here, all of these are more or less 1,550 plus. If you've scored above that, then generally, okay, fine, pretty safe. It's also important to look at the 25th percentile of SAT scores that get in, because these are the scores that actually get in to these schools. And these are actually relatively like less intimidating. Like these are 1400s. They're kind of much easier to achieve. So think about it. In the beginning, think that you're aiming maybe for a score like this. And once you get here, think about jumping up to the higher range. So take it in little steps is what we recommend. There are also these other schools where you can see the range of scores is much higher. While the highest is definitely still in the 1500s, the lowest that they accept is still in the 1200s and 1300s, and that's definitely achievable. So keep your options open, basically. Also, like, look at these schools: UC Berkeley, Georgetown, University of Michigan. These are great schools. UCLA, and they have very achievable SAT scores. So now you kind of know what you should be aiming for. Why it's important to have these goals is so that you feel like you are constantly moving forward and doing something, you know? And yeah.
Yeah, and we also wanted to add, like, I mean, the table that we've got here, right? These are all, like, maybe some of y'all might not have heard the names of all of them, but these are generally like the top US schools, right? That maybe like the top 25 or 30 schools that are, basically considered to be the best in the US. So you don't even have to aim for these. Even aiming one tier lower is perfectly fine because those universities are also really good, and not every good school is listed here, so just keep that in mind.
Yeah, yeah, very true. Tiran, do you want to quickly run us through this?
Yes. So basically, I just want to tell you guys about how the SAT is scored, right? It's I think most of y'all know it's scored out of 1600, right? And the minimum mark you can get is 400. And it's all multiple choice. There are no essays unless you take the SAT optional essay, which is different. Not every school requires that, but the main SAT exam has all multiple choice questions, and there is no penalty for guessing, unlike in certain other tests. So, quick breakdown of the test is, there's the reading section, right? So, those of you who did the practice test on Monday or who have done practice tests on your own will already know this. So, the reading section is 400 points, writing section for 400 points, and the math section for 800 points. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so this is the interesting part, right? And this can get quite confusing if you are not used to it. So the thing is, in your SAT, you will not get it's not a direct mark, right? Unlike school exams, which are like, there are 100 marks, and if you get 75% of them correct, your score is 75. But the SAT actually is a little fairer in the sense that they will scale up your marks according to how well other people have done, how well those particular questions have fared. So, for example, the SAT does things like, if there's a question that like 80% of students got wrong, right? Then they will consider that an unsuccessful question and they will remove that and leave it unmarked. At the same time, like, they'll, like, it's kind of bell curved. I mean, those of y'all who did local A levels will know the Z score also works a little bit like this. So it's kind of bell curved in that, like, oh, if a lot of people have scored very highly, then they'll make it a little hard for you to get a high converted score, right? Whereas if it's been a really difficult test, then they'll try to give as many people high scores as they can. So basically, there will be these raw score conversion tables, right? So every year, this conversion table is a little different. But y'all can get a pretty good idea of it if you go through the raw score conversion tables in some of the practice tests. Like when you download the practice tests from the SAT website, from the College Board website, these come with it. So as y'all can see, for every section, you get a raw score, right? You get a certain amount out of 58 or out of 52 or out of 44. So then that raw score is taken and translated into a converted score depending on the section. So for example, right, if you get 35 out of 58 on the math section, for math you will get 570 out of 800. But at the same time, that translates differently to the reading and writing test. So if you get 35 out of 40 for the reading test, you 35 out of 52 for the reading test, you get a score of 30, which translates kind of to 300 out of 400 for the reading test score, right? So I think you guys can get an idea of how this works. If y'all have any questions, do ask. So how you calculate your score every time you do a practice test is you get your raw score first, and then you look in this table to what it translates to in every section. And then, so for reading, your converted score, you need to multiply it by 10, right? And for maths, you just keep it as it is, and then you add up all this. So you all can see in the example here, if you got 39 for reading, 35 for writing, and 39 for maths, your final score will be 1240 out of 1600. So I hope that's clear to everyone. Yeah, I think we can move straight on into discussing more of the contents of. Yeah,
Yes.
so as for what it looks like, I think you guys must have already seen this, but it's basically multiple choice like this, and they're quite particular about how you fill these in and all that. So you might want to go through like the answer sheets before the exam just to familiarize yourself with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Since most of you have already started some form of prep, I'm not gonna like go super in depth on these things, but instead I'm gonna try and give you as many tips as possible. Of course, this is a brief session, and we will do more in-depth stuff specifically on reading, writing, and math later. That is hopefully more interactive as well, but still, I think there are things to take away. Big thing about the SAT in general, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of content. You need to be able to skim the content very fast without getting lost in it and freaking out about a single word that you don't know, basically. You need to have that kind of confidence. So that's one important thing. What is the reading section like? They basically want to throw to you a whole bunch of different types of content. So that's going to be literature, history, natural science, and social science. When it comes to literature, actually, we'll get into the specifics of this later. Like, I'll do a little bit on each section. But I think what's important to note is that literature and history, you will probably find a lot more complex language. So if you're unfamiliar with vocabulary, or you're a bit more uncomfortable with that, that side of things, then I would recommend reading a lot more of these literature and history passages just casually. But if you are comfortable with that, but graphs and scientific language is your fear, then you need to read more natural science and social science writing, because while these are still articles and they are still meant for the average reader, they do chalk a lot of statistics in there. There's a lot of interpretation to go on. So it's a kind of horrid way of like putting some math in there, some quantitative skills. So that's something to note about the last two sections. Okay, in literature passages, for those of you who haven't done literature before, every time you get a little literature passage, you need to be able to say, like, okay, if I'm telling a layperson, someone who hasn't read this passage before, what it's about, I need to be able to give them all of the important details, right? I need to be able to say who, what, where, why, when, and how. I need to be able to tell them, okay, is this an event going on? Is this an interaction going on? Or is it just a feeling that someone is writing about? Okay? So how do we get this stuff really fast without wasting time? One, in slightly smaller font, you can see this blurb, right? This blurb tells you important details that if you skip the blurb, you will be confused about. So for example, this little line, Matty Silver is Ethan's household employee. That tells us a lot about the relationship already and would explain a lot of interactions that the characters have that we otherwise wouldn't be able to understand simply from this excerpt, because the excerpt is just out of the middle of nowhere, right? So blurb matters. It's going to give you important information. Do not skip it. The two types of passages that you get are either interactions, so two people talking to each other, two people discussing an event happening and people reacting to it, or it can be someone who has just undergone an event and is thinking about their feelings. All right. So it's important to identify, okay, is this passage focused on interactions, or is this passage focused on feelings? The reason that's important is because then the questions will also center around that particular type of passage, right? If the passage is focused on interactions, they're probably not going to ask you too much about like each character's in like emotional state. Rather, they'll ask you about the emotional state relative to an event. So if you know where exactly the event is mentioned in the passage, you can just quickly go back to that event, read that one or two lines, and understand what the character is feeling, as opposed to having to get the entire vibe of the whole passage. So
Yeah,
that's why
and
it's important.
sorry, just want to say
Yeah.
another important thing is they often mark which paragraph the question is related to. Like if you all look through the practice test, they say like from this paragraph, based on or like based on a certain excerpt, what is happening here. So then you don't have to read the rest of it. You can just go straight there, just read that bit. So these are time saving tricks, right?
Yeah. Cool. Also, guys, if you have any questions or doubts at any point, just unmute yourselves and ask. Because yeah, it's just easier that way, and it's super chill. Like we're just like you guys, so don't be afraid to unmute yourself. Cool. Also, because I can't see you, so uh, I would actually need you to unmute yourself to ask a question. Awesome. Next, history passages. Usually, these are speeches about complicated topics, some kind of political topic, a global event, right? So the biggest thing to figure out here, as opposed to in a literature passage, is what is this person trying to prove? And this can get tricky. The reason it can get tricky is because sometimes they might say, oh, my opponents say abortion should be illegal because of XXX reasons. So if you just skim through the paragraph and see this line that says, oh, abortion should be illegal, you're going to come away with the wrong impression. So these passages you need to read very holistically and see, okay, they're acknowledging another side, but what is their real perspective? And does that perspective change based on like certain circumstances? So that's basically what you're doing there, is identifying their thesis, right? Again, if you notice, this can also be figured out from the blurb. This middle sentence right here in the passage, Jordan discusses how and when a United States president may be impeached or charged with serious offenses while in office. So that already gives you a big hint. So now you're just looking for how and when the president can be impeached. You already know what it's going to be about. So cannot stress how important the blurb is. Yeah. Anyway, so here you might find that the language is very old, but that actually doesn't matter. You don't need to understand every word. What you do need to understand is the vibe of what they're saying, basically. Because chances are they're not gonna zoom in and ask you, what does astute mean? They're probably gonna ask you, what is the thesis? What are they trying to prove? What do they think is the biggest problem that commentators on this topic say? So if you don't understand a word, don't freak out. You can learn it later. Not a big deal. Do try to learn words though. It's important. Okay. Any questions? Seeing none, I will move on. Awesome. Science passages. Personally, I found these pretty difficult because they're kind of boring. And but the important thing to remember is that it is still meant to be understood by the general public. Oh, sorry. Okay. What we would recommend here, this applies to both natural science and social sciences. One trick I would give you is to look at the first paragraph and then look at the concluding paragraph as well. This does not mean that you don't read the whole passage, but in general, if you look at the first paragraph, that tells you what they think the problem is, and they almost always introduce the solution or the big push of the article in the end of it. And by the conclusion, they're also trying to wrap up and say the same thing. So the really jargony, annoying bits come in the middle. But if you read the beginning and the conclusion first, and then read the whole thing conclusively, you might have a better idea of what's going on. Yeah. you don't need to spend, like, okay, for example, you see this section on like the average commute rose to yada yada, and then like this really long line. You don't need to remember these statistics, and you don't need to pay too much attention to it while you're going through the passage itself, because when you're going through the questions, if there's a question about it, you can just come back to it and figure it out, right? So don't spend too much time trying to understand every single statistic they throw at you. Go to the questions, see if you need to understand that statistic, and then come back. Personally, that's what I'd recommend. Tirandi,
Yeah,
thoughts?
definitely. I mean, a lot of the time they don't actually ask about the particulars. Mainly in science passages, what they want to know is what's the problem, what is the solution, and maybe something like, okay, what is the author's stance on this particular problem? Or, and yeah, I mean, Shania will get to that in a bit, but the graphs, for example, are a lot more helpful than the passage itself. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, that's very true. Cool. Okay, next bit. And sometimes you will get a paired passage. And this is because people take different stances on most issues. And so, what they want you to do is be able to read two passages of the same stance from different angles or completely different stances, and be able to understand the relationship that the authors have with each other and why. Okay? Um, so, like you can see here, authors could completely oppose with each other. They could agree with the stance but disagree with the argument. So that means disagreeing with the reasons for the stance you're taking. Um, in science, in science articles, you could often disagree with the conclusions of the study. So you might be looking at problems in the data that was given to you, or problems with like how you interpreted the data, or like the paragraphs could just have no relationship to each other. So don't excessively search for a relationship if you think there is none. If you believe that, I would say like, yeah, trust your gut. Don't force it. Just because it's paired, it does not mean that there is a link between them. So this last one is a big trick point that we think you should really watch out for. So, not all of the questions that you will get on these paired passages, not all of them are about the interaction between the passages. Some are just for passage one, some are for passage two. So, how you would do it, we recommend so that your brain doesn't get confused. Read passage one first, answer the questions for passage one, repeat the process for passage two, and now that you've read everything, then deal with the questions asking about the relationship. This might not come intuitively because sometimes the questions asking about the relationship between the two passages will be kind of sandwiched between questions for question one and questions for question two. So you might feel like you need to read everything at once, but you don't need to. You can always just come back to it. It's like the space of 5 questions, right? So it's not like you don't even need to like flip the page. So we would recommend taking this approach just so you don't miss out on details and get too bogged down. Yeah. Cool. Any questions on this?
Yeah, and before we move on to the writing section, just want to tell you guys because a lot of people said that after the practice test, one of the biggest issues is that they didn't have time to read everything and answer the questions in the reading test, right? But so I know like what we're used to doing in our school, like reading comprehension exams and all is first of all, you read the whole passage and you absorb it and then you tackle the questions. The thing is, in the SAT, there is no time to do that. So you kind of have to do this like, forbidden method of just read the important parts, the wherever there are like very rigid statements, wherever there's a conclusion, wherever there are bullet points, focus on those, get the general meaning and skip immediately to the questions. Like you can't do the read the entire passage and then look at the questions method with this. So yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that often happens, particularly with kind of old-fashioned writing, because old-fashioned writing really tends to ramble on, is that you get to the middle of a paragraph and you're like, oh my god, what is going on? Like, what are they talking about? I have no idea. They don't seem to have an idea. What's the point? This is because they use big language and they feel that they're cool because of it. Just if you feel like that at any point, skip to the end of the paragraph, not to the end of the entire passage, but the end of the paragraph. You can tell a lot about a reading from the beginning line of a paragraph and then the end line of the paragraph. Everything in the middle is usually reasons and kind of fluffiness, but basically at the beginning and the end of a paragraph, they're kind of trying to tie everything together and introduce one idea, because generally one paragraph maps onto one idea. I mean, if you're writing well, we hope. So that's a useful tip. And I can tell you that this tip is useful outside of SAT, just the SAT. I actually got this from something like one of my philosophy professors told me. So this is reputable advice. Cool. We will move on into writing now. Don't want to take too much time as well. I know everyone's busy. Cool. Writing is something that often we have to challenge our egos about because we think we can write well. And yes, you can, but sometimes the SAT asks for things that we wouldn't particularly consider normal writing, and that is where we tend to trip up. So most of the questions are about standard English convention. These are just like grammatical rules, and the rest of the questions are about how familiar you are with English. If you are feeling unfamiliar with English and scared, look at the ratio of questions. Most of these questions are actually about the rules. So even if your vocabulary isn't that great, one, your vocabulary can be improved. Two, most of these questions are about rules, grammatical rules, and that you can definitely ace just by studying. So don't worry. Okay, for standard English convention. Now, most of us have spoken English for a while, so we think we know the rules. I can tell you honestly, like, heck, my mom is an editor of a newspaper, and I still don't know my English rules very well. You know, like, if you ask me, why do you put an apostrophe here? I'm like, because it feels like it. And personally, that's why I kind of tripped up in this section at times, because I relied on my intuition. Instead, what you should do, just so you're a bit more aware of how you're approaching it, study the SAT writing rules. If you just Google this, you will learn standard English convention. So we recommend, like, if you guys are taking notes, study the College Panda SAT writing book. And then you can, once you've like made notes of the important rules, then you can do some of the writing sections, look at the answers at the same time, and there are reasons for the answers. So you can identify the type of question that it is, and then you can identify the rules also related to that. Okay, so for example, when it comes to using punctuation, often we don't actually know the rules behind it. So this statement, a semicolon is used to join two independent clauses. For the life of me, I would not have been able to tell you this before I did the SAT, even though, like, I don't know, I'm speaking English for a while. So this is why this little rule is something important to have. So what we'd recommend is get these rules down, put them on post-it notes, have them near you while you're doing practice questions. Every time you have a doubt, you can refer to them, and soon you won't even need them at all. Super easy, great way of studying. You will get there super fast. Cool. So these are some resources. If you want to take a screenshot of this, we personally have benefited a lot from this. We think you guys will too. Okay. Any questions about that bit so far? Seeing none, I will go on. Cool. Rhetorical questions. So these questions are about your familiarity with the language. So this can get into like, okay, should I be using a preposition here right now? Should I be using this verb instead of another verb that sounds kind of similar? This, honestly, the easiest way to ace this is if you are reading often and you are very comfortable, because these questions are easier to answer with intuition. Gotta admit that. But you can also use elimination to figure out the right answer if you aren't sure. And all of us have had to do this regardless of how much we read. So again, we recommend just like studying the College Panda SAT writing book. We'll actually send this resource out to you guys on an email after this, along with the slides, just so it's easier for y'all. So example questions look like this. So why this is a rhetorical question is because they're asking you in the first place, is persecuted for the right word to use here? The reason it's not the right word to use is because persecuted is a more informal, well, not informal, but it's a non-legal term of saying, oh, you have kind of been witch hunted. You have been accused of this terrible thing, yada yada. Why this word wouldn't be appropriate is because they were sent to jail, and these are actual criminal sentences. And when you're taken to court on a criminal sentence, that means you're prosecuted for it, right? So that's just one small example. You can see how similar these words are. So it can get tricky, we admit that, but I think the best way to understand this is through practice. There's no real easy rule to get out of this. Yeah. Cool. That was my section. Before we move on into the math, does anyone have any questions, fears, doubts? Nope. Okay, cool. Kirandi, over to you.
Okay, so math section, it could be something that you feel is easier than the writing section or harder depending on your background in math, right? So the thing is,
Excuse me.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I just have one question regarding what we just discussed.
Yeah.
With regards to the reading passages and stuff, is there like a specification for era and whatnot? Like when it comes to latent history and stuff like that, we are likely to get passages or citations from this particular time frame or texts from this era and stuff like that?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, most of the texts that you will be reading are ridiculously America-centric. So you're going to end up learning like lots of nonsense about American history. That isn't
Right.
necessarily that interesting. So it is American history, as you can see in this example. This is kind of about the 1800s. This is, I'm not actually sure what section this is from. This must be history, no?
I mean, this is the writing section. To be honest, the writing is not very particular because they're not really looking at the content of the passage so much.
Yeah.
But in the reading, yeah, like Shania said, I think what's most important to realize is that it's quite US centric, right? So, I mean, most of the exciting part of US's history that, these people have to write about is, it's mostly regarding like we've said before, stuff like abolition of slavery and women's voting rights. So, like, it's usually centered
Yeah.
around key events in US history like that. So, maybe it'll help to find readings about those topics and go over them, not because you have to learn what happened at that point, but just for some familiarity with the terms and things like that.
Yeah. Actually, Ridmaka, that's a actually great point, because if you have never heard of, like, I don't know, the US Civil War and why it was fought, you'd be super confused if, there was an article that referenced it as if everyone knows why it happened. Like, yeah, and they really do think that everyone knows what goes on in their lives. Like, what goes on in America. Like, they really assume that, even though it's an international exam. So actually, Ritmaka, great point. We'd recommend like even just Google and maybe even the Wikipedia page. If not, the Britannica.edu pages are great too. Check out the topics of abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, basically getting the right to vote in America, and also in Britain, because I've seen that come up a couple of times. Martin Luther King.
Maybe a little bit about Native American history.
Yes. Again, you don't need to get super into this. You don't need to learn the history, but it's important to know that these things happen. I mean, even if we don't live in America, I think it's still important to know that they had a civil war to get rid of slavery. Small things like this. And even reading about these things will help you become more comfortable just in reading, right? So even if it's boring at times, consider it an investment.
Okay.
Thanks,
If
Shubhankar.
you guys have any other questions about reading, writing, English, please ask.
Just one more.
Yeah.
The US centric principle, does it apply for literature, natural sciences, and stuff like that as well? Or would that come up from any part of the world?
Actually, I think for one thing, natural sciences, social sciences can pretty much come from anywhere in the world
Yeah.
because I mean there are people who write about all those things. So I mean they can talk about innovations in China, or they can talk about like a survey done in like Africa, something like that. So I think that's quite broad. Literature, I don't know, Shania, do you wanna?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say literature is generally pretty America slash UK centric.
But oh,
Because
sorry.
sorry, yeah,
I think I should make an addition here. Sometimes it is like America, UK centric, but they also sometimes get English writing from international authors. I've noticed this in a few exams, right, where they specifically use, like, for example, I read this text which is about like Japanese people, but it's written in English, and it even uses a few like Japanese words with English explanations, right? But sometimes they use those to kind of check how you can understand completely like new concepts that come up. So there are texts which are set in other cultures as well, but they're always written in like perfect English and not a lot of usage of non-English words.
yeah. I think as you do practice tests, the general trend though is still, set in white countries. That's a trend. And it'll be kind of settings from just after the Industrial Revolution, maybe. So that's kind of what you're dealing with. I
Thank you,
haven't seen
Tirani. Thank
anything
you,
super
Sonia.
modern. Yeah, no worries.
Best way to check is, as usual, downloading and reading practice tests.
Yeah. Any other questions? If someone wants to drop a question in the chat also, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And we can even deal with that at the end, no?
Yeah, we
So,
can.
if they want to. Cool. So why don't you move on to the math section?
Math section. Okay.
I think we're roughly on time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you guys know math section has two sections, right? No calculator and calculator. So I made this mistake because I've been using a calculator for so long now. But for local A levels, we did not use calculators, right? So local A level students, if you don't have a scientific calculator, now is a good time to buy one. And I was very confused about this because I did not know what it was. It's not like the square calculator with just the addition subtraction, but it also has like square root functions, integration, all that sort of thing. So first of all, everything is O level math with some additional stuff thrown in. So it's like O level math but with a higher difficulty, which means that they might give you stuff from beyond an O level syllabus, but they'll give it to you in a way that you can generally figure it out even if you've never studied that concept in school. So, breakdown of the timing. So, no calculator, there are 20 questions with 25 minutes. So, you can see that section is fairly rushed. Calculator section, there's 38 questions with 55 minutes. And you all need to know that these questions are separated. So, normally you're supposed to, I think, keep your calculator like under the table on the floor. You can't even keep it on your desk during the no calculator section. And you have to do those questions at that time. And calculator test, you can basically use it, but those are separated, so you can't like carry forward time. Okay, going to the next one. Shani? Yeah.
Sorry.
So
Yeah.
for SAT math, I would say best thing to do is do the practice tests, right? And like I said, the concepts aren't hard. So what we mean is like, okay, for example, we've noticed that circle questions come up in practice tests, right? And I think you guys pointed this out to us as well. So the thing is, they're not going to expect that you know the equation of a circle and then ask you to solve something about it, because that kind of thing is normally not covered in O level math. But what they might do is give you an equation of a circle, say this is how the equation of a circle looks, and this is what these variables represent, and then they'll give you a value and say, okay, find the coordinates of the center, find the perimeter, something like that. So if you know circles, it will be easy for you to just intuitively figure it out because you already know how it works. If you don't know it, you have to spend a little bit of extra time trying to figure out how does this equation work, right? So that's why it really helps to like do the practice tests, find the concepts that you're uncomfortable with, and then try and learn those. So, for example, Khan Academy, I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have heard of it. It's an amazing free learning resource on the internet. You can use it for pretty much any subject, but they have specified SAT, math, and writing online courses which y'all can take. So yeah, and the other thing is questions are sometimes designed to be slightly different than what you expect, so you have to read very carefully. So like, this equation, if you look at it, right, seems pretty straightforward. But remember, they're asking find the value of x plus 1. So a lot of us will just solve this as fast as we can and put down the answer for x, right? But this is a multiple choice test, so you do not get marks for workings, and you have to be very careful about the final answer that they're asking for. Shanya, next slide.
Yeah, sorry. Just want to turn the lights on.
Okay. Yeah, so this is just what we said about the different types of topics there are. So this is stuff to watch out for beyond O-level math, right? Circle is one thing, basic trigonometry, polynomial functions. I think y'all probably would have heard of some of this stuff. So not all these are necessary, but stuff like the remainder and factor theorem, for example, is really useful. Like you'll wish that we knew this during O-levels because it makes life so much easier. And don't worry, I mean, we'll help you guys out if there's like anything that y'all are confused about, especially those who haven't done math beyond O levels. And also Khan Academy videos for pretty much any math concept. They're the best place to learn from. Yeah, next slide.
Yeah. Like, I can't stress enough how important YouTube is as a resource. If you aren't already like super reliant on it for your studies, I mean, I would say that Khan Academy got me through like a lot of A-level math. And like, it's important to know that you can take charge of your own learning, particularly with math. I think we're very used to going for tuition, very used to being taught it. But there are people on the internet who are great at teaching it virtually. So don't be afraid to just try it out. It might actually be better than a live tutor. But if you need a live tutor, of course, that's also fine. But I would say really try out YouTube. Amazing resource.
Yeah. Okay, so these are the main steps if you want to, like, when y'all are doing your study schedules. Learning the logic is like 90%, honestly. If you ask me, it's not about memorizing ways to solve questions. It's if you know the logic, everything will just come naturally to you. Yeah, learn the logic, learn the content, do practice tests will help with a lot of things, right? It's also about experience, because when you're more used to how the timing works and stuff like that, you'll find it a lot easier to do, and it'll also help you identify those hidden small topics that you don't know very much about, so that then you have a chance to learn them before the exam. Yeah, and one more thing that so about before we move on to the next section, right? About the calculator section, this is quite misleading because not all the questions in the in the calculator section need a calculator. Like a lot of them are just normal, like polynomial equations and stuff, which you can just solve by hand. So don't waste time thinking like what is the catch in this question, or trying to solve it using a calculator and plugging like polynomials into it. Just if you can solve it by hand, especially if you're used to doing that in local A levels, just solve it and finish it off, right? So don't try to use the calculator for everything. Yeah, so basically we're done with the content of the SAT exam now. So if you guys have, yeah,
one thing I just wanted to add that freaked me out when I saw the SAT math section is because they'll drop like irrational and imaginary numbers around. Like, if you haven't heard, there is an imaginary number called I. I knew that this existed. I did not know how to use it in math or how to approach it. Often they're not going to ask you for complicated things, but it's just important to know that if you see it, don't worry, you're not freaking out. Like, don't freak out. Just do a little Google, understand what it is, and move on. Okay, it's not like uni math or anything. It's very normal.
Yeah, exactly. So remember, Google is your friend, and also if there's anything that Google and Khan Academy cannot help you with, like please email us. All of us have done the SAT, so I mean, I think we can manage some extent of questions. Some of us have done like A level and uni level math, so just please just reach out and ask if there's anything that's confusing. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions about math or any other SAT content, just tell us and then we'll move on to a very short explanation about registering and the SAT, how the test works and that sort of thing.
Yeah, actually, for yeah, no, it's fine because we're okay. No worries. So let's take most of the content questions now, hopefully. And if anyone has to go, you can. And like, if you've already registered, like that's fine. We're just gonna give you a couple of tips for like on the day as well at the end. But if you need to go, that's fine. We've gone through most of the content.
Is there a restriction on what you can do with the calculator? Like some functions we're not allowed to use or anything? Nothing like that, right?
Yeah, so basically, Nutara, it's like the types of calculators you can bring are specified, right? You can take any type of scientific calculator, and that basically what that means is you can use the scientific calculator to do anything that you can do with it. Graphing calculators are restricted. You can't take every type of graphing calculator, but you can take some. And programmable calculators, personally, I still have to this date do not know what a programmable calculator is, but whatever those are, they're not allowed because they make life a lot easier. So if you can take a calculator, you can do anything you want with it. That's how it works.
Right, the Cambridge
so just-
calculator is okay, right?
Yeah, I think that's a normal scientific cal, so should work.
Is that
Right.
the FX?
The Casio FX series.
Ah, yeah.
It's like gray, very
Yeah.
thin with a blue cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one is
Go
fine.
back.
Right, thanks.
Okay, cool.
Anything else? Okay, if you guys think of anything, just drop it in the chat or ask us after. So yeah, very quickly just going through how to register because I think a lot of y'all would have registered, but for those of you who haven't, this is going to be really important. Yeah. Okay, so the SAT is administered by this organization called College Board, right? So you have to go to collegeboard.org and there you need to create an account wherever, somewhere here. And using this account, you can register for the SAT. So just, explore the website. This website also has a lot of details about SAT, like dates, how it works, the rules. It has a lot of practice tests on the website itself. So explore this website as much as you can and you can use it to register for the SAT. And also remember that this is the site through which you submit your financial aid applications when you're applying to college much later. Yeah, so if we'll try and send out a guide on registering because sometimes filling up some of the questions can be tricky and we'll send that out later. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so these are the upcoming test dates, the next few, right? So on October 2nd, there is a SAT sitting and the deadline for registering is coming up soon. It may be, I think, somewhere around the end of August or middle or beginning of September. So I suggest that y'all go to the College Board site and check right now and register if you can. So of these sittings, if you want to apply to college in this coming cycle, you will have to do either the October or the December SAT because March and May, the results will come long after they have like gone through your application, so it won't come on time. So prioritize getting the October one because if you mess up in the October test, you can always retake it in December. And from those two, they will send your best score, not your last score, but the best one. So yeah, last possible sitting for this cycle is December. So if y'all haven't registered, you might want to do it soon. Yeah. Okay, so just very basically going over the rules. We put this in because like sometimes we are not used to how rigid these rules are, because normally in Sri Lanka they make accommodations, like you tell them that you forgot something or something like that, they'll find the way to get it done. But at the SAT that will not happen. They are very very strict. So remember, no phones, no smartwatches. Like I took my phone to the exam and I had to leave it outside. So if you can, don't bring it, or else if you're bringing it, there will be a place to leave it outside the center. um, and about stationery, these are such small things, but they can be really important if you don't read the rules carefully. Only use HB pencils on the test. This is a crazy rule, right? But it's because they mark the test electronically. So if you write even with like a mechanical pencil, right, or like a different weight of pencil, it won't get picked up. If you write with a pen, it won't get picked up and you will get a 0 on the test. So please only use HB pencils. Don't take rulers, they are not allowed because you can use them to measure stuff. So only take the pencils, eraser and sharpener. No rulers, no compasses, protractors, stuff like that is banned. About the calculators, you can find guidelines about what kind of calculators are allowed. You can bring all scientific calculators and only some graphing calculators. Very important. Take a photo ID such as your NIC or passport and your admission ticket. The admission ticket, you have to print it and it has to have the correct date and your name and everything on it, and take it with you. So yeah, we're not going to go over the rules and all at length. Just wanted to mention these because these are like the most vital stuff. So y'all can find the full list of rules at collegeboard.org. So go and read those. And I think next we just have like this really short video about what you should do before the SAT. And yeah.
A few months before the SAT, I set up a regular
Can you hear my? Could you hear the sound?
Yeah, we can. It's lagging a bit, but just
Oh.
I think if we listen to it, it'll be okay.
study schedule using official SAT practice on Khan Academy.
It really helped me focus on the areas where I needed the most work and got me to practice regularly.
2 weeks before test day, I took a practice test to check my progress, and it really showed me what the actual test would be like.
About 3 days before the test, I checked my test center's location and made sure I knew how to get there, so I planned to leave myself plenty of time.
I packed my bag the night before, so I had my admission ticket, my photo ID, some snacks, number 2 pencils, and a calculator.
When I woke up on test day, I ate a good breakfast, so I had plenty of energy.
Once I got to the testing center, I sat down at the desk. I reminded myself how much I practiced.
I felt confident because I'd done everything I could to make sure I would do my very best.
For more information on how you can feel prepared for the SAT, go to sat.org/taking the test. Bye.
Cute.
Yeah, so I think we've pretty much reached the end of this session. And if y'all have any questions at all about content, about scoring, about the rules, you can ask us.